Earl McKinley watched the delivery truck rumble up the gravel path, hauling behind it the tiny wooden cabin he'd spent 6 months designing. The driver hopped down and began unfastening the straps, grunting as he maneuvered the wheels into place. Earl stood with his hands in the pockets of his wool flannel jacket, the hem brushing just above his work boots. A sharp autumn breeze tugged at the fringes of his silver beard. Around him, the town of Pine Hollow lay quiet in late October calm. The aspens had dropped most of their leaves, forming gold and crimson carpets over the yards. Chimneys puffed smoke into the pale sky, and somewhere a distant dog barked without urgency. Earl had chosen this place for peace, the kind that didn't require explanation. He didn't expect peace to have so many eyes. From behind half-drawn curtains, faces appeared. Just for a second, quick glances from windows across the cul-de-sac. Curtains swayed shut again. He waved anyway. The truck inched the cabin into place, a simple, gabled structure with a wide porch, knotty pine walls, and dark green shutters he'd painted himself in his garage back in Pueblo. The porch would hold a chair or two and his old banjo, maybe some wind chimes if the HOA didn't throw a fit. Not that he planned to ask. Earl signed a final form, nodded to the driver, and wandered down the hill toward the general store. The bell above the door jingled like something out of a Christmas card. Inside, he found a sack of firewood, a bundle of caulking tubes, and a cheerful clerk named Ruth, who reminded him of his sister. "You'll need extra insulation up in Pine Hollow," she said, ringing up the firewood. "That wind sneaks through everything." "I've got thick socks and thicker walls," Earl replied. "Should do fine." Outside, he sipped from a thermos of black coffee laced with honey, the way his late wife used to make it. The warmth settled into his chest as he glanced up the street, just in time to spot a silver SUV creeping past his cabin. It paused. Behind the wheel sat a woman with a blonde bob, a clipboard angled against the steering wheel like a co-pilot. She didn't wave. Back at the cabin, Earl arranged pine cones along the porch railing. He screwed a hook into the eave and hung the old rocking chair that had once belonged to his grandfather. The chain creaked as it swayed. Satisfied, he stepped inside and lit the fire. Bluegrass crackled from an old radio on the mantel while he fiddled with the clock on the wall, realigning its brass hands. Just before dusk, he heard a thunk at the door. A crisp white envelope peeked from the mailbox. The return address read, Pine Hollow HOA, attention, K. Whitlow. Inside was a glossy welcome packet. Earl flipped past the cover letter and index, straight into a section titled Aesthetic Guidelines. The tone was cheerful but firm: color restrictions, lawn maintenance, porch decor limits. His brow furrowed deeper with every paragraph. Somewhere between acceptable porch ornamentation and approved roofline angles, he let out a breath and sat down on the edge of the rocker. A small yellow sticky note fluttered from the pages and landed at his feet. He picked it up. "See me about your roofline, Karen." He stared at the neat, looping handwriting. A gust of wind rattled the porch screen, and in the distance, the silver SUV rolled slowly down the street again. Karen's voice echoed off the pine-paneled walls of the clubhouse, "Our standards are what keep Pine Hollow respectable." The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow over the metal chairs and stale snickerdoodles laid out on a folding table. Earl McKinley sat near the back, fingers laced on his lap, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee untouched beside him. He scanned the room, noting how most of the dozen attendees nodded in rhythm with Karen's words, some out of agreement, others perhaps habit. But not everyone. Mildred Parker, wrapped in a lavender shawl fastened with a delicate brooch, stared steadily ahead. Her hands rested calmly over her handbag, eyes watchful but patient. A veteran of these gatherings, she rarely spoke unless necessary. Karen moved like she owned the space. Her blouse was perfectly pressed, clipboard tucked like a badge under one arm. "We've had reports of certain recent additions that may not align with our visual harmony goals," she said with the careful cadence of someone practiced in sounding polite while sharpening a knife. A few glances slid Earl's way. He kept still, meeting no one's eye. "The cabin," someone whispered behind a hand. Karen smiled as though hearing it. "Now, I'm sure it was built with the best intentions. But we must all remember, If we bend the rules for one, we must bend them for all. A quiet cough. Then Mildred's voice, soft but precise, "You said the same thing about my raised beds last spring." Silence followed. Karen's smile flickered. That situation was different. Vegetables attract pests. They fed the food pantry, Mildred replied. Karen turned back to her clipboard. Moving on. Earl studied her face, calm and composed, yet brittle under pressure. His mind wandered back to the sticky note, still on his counter, and the careful handwriting that had seemed less like a suggestion and more like a summons. The meeting droned on, pet waste reminders, Halloween decoration limits, the price of repainting the clubhouse trim. When it ended, people filed out quickly, murmuring their goodbyes and brushing cookie crumbs from their sleeves. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the last of the golden leaves across the parking lot. Earl paused by the flagpole, watching Karen unlock her SUV. To his surprise, she looked up and offered a nod, not warm, but civil. An hour later, as he tightened a loose shutter on the side of the cabin, her SUV pulled into his gravel drive. He didn't speak as she approached. Karen folded her arms. "Nice little place you've got here." Earl dusted his hands on his jeans. "Appreciate it. Though," she added, looking up, from the road, "it reads a bit shed-like." "I designed it to blend into the land," he said, voice calm. "Built it myself." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We'll be in touch." She turned on her heel, the crunch of gravel punctuating each step as she walked back to her vehicle. At dusk, Earl fed the birds from a tin bowl he kept near the porch. A robin fluttered down, perching on the banister as if weighing whether to trust him. He set the tin down slowly, so as not to startle it. The little bird tilted its head, then chirped once. Inside, he washed his hands and lit the fireplace, letting the crackling warmth chase away the damp cold that settled in the bones this time of year. Just as he set his mug down on the counter, he noticed the envelope on the floor. No stamp. No creases. Someone had slipped it under the door. He bent and opened it. Formal notice of violation, structure, appearance and placement. Immediate HOA review pending. The letter was printed in Helvetica, bolded and underlined, notice of non-compliance. Earl McKinley let the paper settle in his hands, its sharp fold still resisting the crease he had pressed into it. The language was sterile but the message clear: his cabin was a problem, and he was now officially on record. He read through it twice, then a third time, each pass sharpening the quiet irritation stirring in his chest. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the stovepipe, but the little cabin held its warmth. Flames danced behind the glass of the wood stove, casting amber patterns across the floorboards. Earl reached for his mug, sipped the lukewarm coffee, and stepped to the back wall where several old storage boxes sat stacked in a narrow closet space. He pulled down one with worn lettering, Colorado 89. Within it, wrapped in an old red bandana, was a folder marked, Clyde, Land Records. He brought the contents to the table, yellowed papers, survey sketches in pencil, and a deed typed on an IBM Selectric. There were notes in the margin, some in Earl's hand, others in blocky scrawl he recognized instantly. Clyde Jensen had been the previous owner. A wiry man with a laugh that came from the chest and a distrust of bureaucracy deeper than most wells. Earl smiled faintly, remembering how Clyde once joked while patching a fence line, "One day this land will stir up some fun. Mark me." Now, that prophecy felt less like a joke and more like a nudge from the past. Later that morning, Earl parked his truck in front of the county records office. The building squatted like an afterthought beside the fire station, its windows fogged and the flag out front caught in a twist of its own making. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and faint mildew. A few dusty plastic plants lined the entry. A young clerk greeted him without much enthusiasm, clearly surprised to see someone carrying a folder thick with paper. "Can I help you?" "I need to check original surveys for Plot 34B, Earl said. The clerk blinked. "Most of those are digital now, but we've still got the paper books." He led Earl through a hallway lined with dented file cabinets. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed with intermittent flickers. Earl set up camp at a side table, laying out his folder and cross-checking the lines. It took nearly an hour, but the discrepancy revealed itself with the clarity of a rock in a stream. The original easement for the HOA's shared lot, the one where the clubhouse stood, had never been properly transferred. The title had a gap, a dangling line of authority that no one had corrected. He turned to the clerk. "Does this mean?" The young man flipped through the record. "Technically, they've been using that lot without a deed transfer. It's still listed under the previous subdivision owner. Doesn't say anything about the HOA." Earl exhaled through his nose and leaned back, letting the ceiling's buzz settle around him. Outside, clouds had rolled in. He stepped back into the autumn chill, the folder tucked under his arm. The wind lifted the edge of his coat as he approached his truck. Across the seat sat a small pie tin, still warm. Mildred must have left it while he was inside, no note, just flaky crust and cinnamon cutting the air. Her way of saying she saw what was happening. That night, the lights in the cabin flickered once, then steadied. Earl lit the old brass lantern anyway, more for comfort than necessity, and placed it near the stove. Shadows moved across the wall as he set the deed folder beside the violation notice. He didn't smile often, not since retirement, but this was different. The lines didn't just not match, someone had built a clubhouse on land they didn't own. Earl picked up the phone, scrolled through his contacts, and tapped a name he hadn't used in years. "Charlie," he said when the line picked up. "Yeah, it's Earl. Got something you might want to hear." The signature was faded, but still legible, Clyde H. Whitaker, 1995. Earl tilted the brittle page toward the pale morning light, watching dust flicker across the surface like lazy fireflies. The record room smelled of dry paper and furnace heat. He adjusted his glasses and ran a fingertip over the ink, grinning softly. The line he'd traced on the survey map the night before matched exactly. "Well, would you look at that," he murmured, the satisfaction quiet but full. The county clerk's office was mostly empty, save for the whir of an old desktop and the occasional thump of a file drawer. Jenna, the town clerk, leaned over the counter, her chin resting on her palm. "You sure know how to wake up an old archive," she said, peering at the document. "This hasn't seen daylight in 20 years. Earl chuckled. Figured it was time to take it for a stroll. He handed her a neatly folded document, Clyde's old note and a faded survey map. "Got someone who can confirm the transfer?" Jenna nodded, rummaging through a box labeled pre-2000, dusty but true. "Sure do. You're lucky, these things usually get lost in a flood or someone's garage sale." She brought out a notary stamp and looked him over. "You filing this now?" He slid a fresh form across the desk. "And here's a transfer signed by Clyde's nephew. Dollar exchange, just like Clyde wanted." Jenna blinked, impressed. $1? Tradition, Earl said. Man hated clutter. Loved simple things. She filed the paperwork, gave it a satisfying stamp, and placed a yellow confirmation slip in his palm. Earl held it like a small shield. By mid-afternoon, a light snow had begun to settle on the sidewalks. Earl parked his truck near the diner, brushing flakes off his shoulders before heading in. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Mildred was already there, seated in a corner booth, her shawl draped neatly over the seat beside her. Steam rose from her mug, curling toward the stained glass lamp overhead. She looked up, smiled gently. "You look like a man who just found gold." "Something like that." He slid in across from her, ordered a coffee, and laid the yellow slip between them. Her eyes narrowed, reading. "You own the lot." He nodded. "Clubhouse is sitting on it. Without a deed transfer, technically they've been squatting." Mildred let out a long breath, the corners of her mouth tugging upward. "Karen won't like that." "I expect not." He sipped the hot coffee Jenna had brought. "But I don't aim to be cruel. Just firm." Outside the window, snow clung to the bare branches like powdery lace. For a moment, they both watched in silence, the kind that settles when two people know things are shifting beneath the surface. Later that evening, Earl returned to his cabin to find another envelope slid under the door. Thicker this time. He opened it by the fire, unfolded 3 stapled pages filled with bolded phrases and italics. Immediate repaint of visible roof structures, 1 line read. Violation of visual cohesion. He whistled low, then tucked the letter into a drawer beside the welcome packet. From another drawer, he withdrew a freshly stamped document and slipped it into a folder labeled Active Claims. With precise handwriting, he scrawled across the front, "No trespassing, filed." The diner's meatloaf special and rhubarb pie still sat warm in his belly, but it was the finality of the stamped order that comforted him most. For the first time since the cabin had rolled down the gravel path, Earl felt Pine Hollow shifting, not away from him, but towards something just. He filed a temporary "no trespassing" order. Karen hasn't seen it yet. No clubhouse. What do you mean, the clubhouse is closed? Karen shrieked. The words rang across the frosty Thanksgiving morning like a fire alarm gone rogue. Her voice, sharp as icicles, echoed through the open air as neighbors began arriving in wool coats and gloves, casserole dishes in hand. The parking lot, usually buzzing with holiday chatter, had turned still, the only sound now the shuffling of boots over frostbitten gravel. A handwritten sign, nailed neatly to the double doors of the HOA clubhouse, fluttered in the breeze. The red ink read, "Access restricted, pending land use clarification." Beneath it was the stamped emblem of the county registrar's office. Tom, carrying a foil-covered tray of green bean casserole, squinted at the notice. Is this a joke? Karen turned to the small crowd gathering behind her, lips tight, breath fogging. This is vandalism, she barked. An abuse of procedure. Earl stood farther back, hands in his coat pockets, his face unreadable. He had arrived early, not to witness the chaos, but to make sure no one forced the padlock he'd had installed with the town's permission. He hadn't said a word when the first shocked gasp started. And he didn't say a word now as Karen's voice pitched higher with each accusation. Later that morning, in the corner booth of Millie's diner, the warmth of coffee and hash browns was doing its best to cut the tension. I knew it was him, Karen snapped, her cheeks still flushed from the cold. He waited until the holiday on purpose. Tom stirred his cup slowly. Sign had the town's seal on it. He probably bribed someone, she said, ignoring the glance Tom gave her. Or blackmailed them. That man's a menace. Earl sat a few seats down the counter, sipping black coffee with the calm of a man who had learned long ago the power of silence. When Karen turned to confront him directly, he didn't rise to her bait. I followed the law, he said simply. Nothing more. Karen slammed her napkin on the table. You've disrupted a 20-year tradition. You've made this personal. No, Karen, Earl said, eyes level. You did that when you decided pine cones were a violation. The clatter of silverware dulled. A few patrons exchanged glances. Someone coughed discreetly into a sleeve. That afternoon, snow began to flurry softly across Pine Hollow. The clubhouse sat empty and locked while voices and warmth flowed instead from Mildred Parker's house. Her curtains glowed golden, and the smell of turkey drifted out onto the porch. Inside, the long dining table had been extended with folding leaves. Earl sat near the end, sharing quiet conversation with Tom, who mentioned between bites of yam that he'd been fined last spring for his wind chimes being too chimey. Real cranberry sauce, Mildred beamed, setting a second bowl down. None of that canned nonsense. Bless you, someone said, already spooning a second helping. Children, grandkids visiting for the holiday, played quietly by the hearth, and the fireplace crackled with a gentle persistence. Laughter came in waves, never loud, just warm. And in the center of it all, Mildred moved between chairs, her wool gloves tucked into her apron pocket, her brooch catching the firelight. Outside, snowflakes drifted thicker. Through the window, the clubhouse loomed across the street, dark, locked, forgotten for the day. By evening, the streets of Pine Hollow had gone still again. Earl returned to his cabin, the porch light already glowing amber in the snow-swept dusk. He noticed it before he stepped up, the square of paper, weighted down by a small rock. He peeled it loose, read the blocky handwriting without expression. HOA emergency meeting. Be there. He looked out toward the road, toward the dark silhouette of the clubhouse beyond, then folded the note in half and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't smile, but the flicker in his eye was unmistakable. Something was changing. And the storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. The folding table wobbled as Earl set down a thick stack of legal papers. Plastic chairs creaked as the HOA members shifted uncomfortably in the cold. Karen's front yard had never hosted a meeting before, but with the clubhouse locked and the holiday buzz still in the air, she had scrambled to assert control. Flyers had gone out hastily, many still warm from the printer. An extension cord snaked from her garage to power the battery-powered mic that no one could hear clearly over the wind. Karen stood stiffly behind the table, clipboard in hand like a general without an army. This emergency meeting, she began, was called to address a breach of decorum and community standards. Namely, the inappropriate misuse of procedural delay tactics to undermine. I brought the deed, Earl said evenly. Karen flinched slightly as he opened the folder and began laying out certified copies, one at a time. Each page bore the embossed county seal. The stack seemed endless. Ownership of the lot under the clubhouse, Earl continued, was never legally transferred to the HOA. It remained under Clyde Whitaker's name. I purchased it last week with a notarized contract. That's not sabotage. That's property law. Karen scoffed, loud enough for the wind to carry. I don't need paperwork, I have standards. Tom, bundled in a green windbreaker, leaned forward in his chair. You had standards when you fined me for repainting my shed. Said earth tones only. I checked later, wasn't even in the guidelines. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Mildred folded her hands in her lap. You cited me for hanging laundry. Said it disrupted the view. Karen's eyes darted from face to face. This is all beside the point. The integrity of our community is at stake. You want to turn this place into a circus? No, Earl said, calmly. But people should know who's really in charge of what. Karen's lips twitched. You think this proves something? So you own a plot of land. That doesn't give you authority. I'm still the president of this association. But for how long? Someone muttered from the back. Karen's face darkened. This is a coordinated ambush. You're all ungrateful. I've protected Pine Hollow for years. She snatched a few of the papers off the table, crumpled one, flung it to the ground. The wind caught it and sent it fluttering toward the hedges. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, her voice breaking. But no one moved. Tom stood slowly, the legs of his chair scraping the driveway. Maybe you've protected it, sure. But from who? A silence fell, broken only by the rustling of dry leaves and the hum of a passing car. Across the street, a boy stood holding his father's hand, watching the scene unfold. He tugged his dad's coat and whispered, "Who's the angry lady?" The man didn't answer. Earl gathered the papers calmly, slipping them back into the manila folder. His thermos had leaked slightly, leaving a dark ring on the table. Mildred passed him a folded napkin without a word. As he turned to leave, someone behind him spoke, soft, but clear enough to carry. Maybe it's time for new leadership. Earl didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The wind was already shifting. Ma'am, we'll need to review all HOA financials for the past 5 years. The words cut through the murmuring in Pine Hollow's modest town hall like a snowplow scraping the morning street. Karen stood frozen at the front, one hand on the back of a chair, the other clutching a folder now slightly damp with sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of residents bundled in wool and thermals, their breath still thawing from the walk across the icy lot. The walls smelled of overcooked radiator heat and old pine cleaner. In one corner sat Mrs. Fay Little, city auditor, short and silver-haired, her expression unreadable as she laid a small voice recorder on the table in front of her. Karen laughed, but it was the brittle, paper-dry kind. This is a private organization. You can't just barge in. Mrs. Little interrupted politely, actually, with documented complaints and reasonable suspicion of financial mismanagement, I'm required to. This meeting was publicly posted. I'm merely here as an observer, for now. Earl leaned back in his chair, arms folded. His thermos sat untouched beside a fruitcake wrapped in wax paper. Only Tom had broken off a cautious corner earlier, chewing thoughtfully as the drama brewed. At first, Karen tried to talk over the questions. She rifled through papers, avoiding eye contact. All expenses were approved by the board. Which board? Someone called out. You've never let anyone else be on it. Another voice, from the back, added, where did the $900 go last spring for beautification? Karen flipped to a sheet, cleared her throat. Planters. Custom cedar planters. Mildred raised her hand without standing. They never showed up. They were delayed, Karen snapped. Supply chain issues. Mrs. Little tilted her head. Any documentation to support that? Karen rifled harder. The sound of crinkling paper filled the hall. No receipts. No vendor emails. Just line items scrawled in black pen and a vaguely dated spreadsheet. Tom set down his coffee cup. You fined my wife $200 for planting sunflowers. Said they weren't HOA approved. They weren't, Karen said, her voice pitching higher. Mrs. Little nodded slowly. May I see the approval policy for plantings? Karen opened another folder, then another. Finally, she looked at Earl. Did you do this? Earl didn't blink. I filed a concern. Anyone could have. From beneath his chair, he pulled a blue binder, its spine labeled in tidy block letters, Pine Hollow HOA, Observations and Irregularities. Inside were printouts, highlighted copies of contradictory guidelines, photocopied violation letters, and 10 handwritten testimonies, each signed and dated. Mrs. Little accepted it with a nod. This will be useful. Karen's cheeks had flushed a deep, ruddy red. This is absurd. You're all acting like I pocketed the money. Silence. Mrs. Little opened her leather notebook. Well then, I'm formally suspending HOA Financial Authority pending a full review. Any further disbursements, fines, or adjustments must be frozen until this investigation concludes. Mildred gasped softly. Tom exhaled through his nose, pleased. Karen's lips trembled. Her fingers closed slowly around her papers. She looked at the faces in the room, faces she had once commanded with a glance, now watching her with wary patience or quiet disdain. You people deserve what's coming, she spat. Then she swept up her folder, knocking over a plastic cup of lukewarm town hall coffee, and stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking unevenly on the linoleum. The door slammed. No one moved at first. Only the scratching of a pen broke the silence as one neighbor resumed taking notes in a leather-bound journal, eyes narrowed behind round glasses. Mrs. Little looked up. Shall we continue? She asked mildly. Earl picked up his thermos, unscrewed the cap, and poured himself a small cup. The fruitcake sat untouched again. Outside, snow piled softly against the windows, but inside, the thaw had already begun. 2 weeks later, Earl hung a string of warm white lights on his porch. No one complained. The snow had deepened over Pine Hollow, smoothing the lawns into soft white blankets. Icicles clung to the eaves like delicate glass teeth, and the last of autumn's crisp leaves had vanished beneath the frost. Earl adjusted one of the hooks above the window frame and stood back to look. The lights cast a mellow golden hue over the pine cones, the old rocking chair, and the flannel blanket draped across it. The same porch Karen once called an eyesore was now glowing softly in winter stillness. From the sidewalk, Mildred waved with one mittened hand, the other balancing a small tin of pecan fudge. For your Sunday porch coffee, she said as she reached the steps. Earl took the tin with a smile. That recipe from your sister again? Worse, she teased. Mine. They laughed, and behind them, Tom stepped out of his front door, wind chimes clinking gently against the eaves of his porch. No more fines. No more letters on the doorstep. Just a modest melody in the cold morning air. Karen hadn't been seen since the day of the audit. Rumor had it she resigned by email, no apology, no explanation. When the final meeting was held, her chair remained empty. The vote to dissolve the HOA passed with more relief than celebration. A sheet cake from the grocery store read, "Here's to Pine Hollow, free and friendly." The frosting was too sweet, but the sentiment felt just right. Earl didn't linger long that night. He walked home with a thermos in hand, kicking at small piles of snow like a boy. At his porch, he found a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. Inside, tucked neatly in a bed of pine needles, was a birdhouse carved from oak. A note lay beneath it, written in Mildred's tidy cursive, "This was Harold's. He built it the winter we moved in. Said the birds deserved better than plastic." Earl traced a finger over the grooves in the wood. "They sure do," he murmured, then quietly mounted it beneath the eaves, just beside the porch light. Sunday came, and with it a quiet stream of neighbors. Some brought mugs, others cookies, a few just their hands deep in coat pockets. Tom leaned against the railing, watching the smoke curl from Earl's old stovepipe. Mildred handed out her cranberry scones, loudly insisting she'd outbaked herself this year. A boy from down the block, the same one who once asked, "Who's the angry lady?" ran circles around a snowman with a twig for a smile and buttons missing on one side. Then came the knock. A man Earl didn't recognize stood at the base of the steps, his breath puffing in the air, wool cap pulled low over silver hair. "I'm Nathan," he said. "Live on Birch Street. We haven't talked much." Earl nodded once, inviting him up with a gesture. Nathan climbed the steps slowly, then stopped, looking at the porch light, the birdhouse, the circle of chairs and easy conversation. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up for all of us. For not yelling. For making it better." Earl poured him a mug. "Cream or honey?" "Honey." They clinked cups quietly and leaned back into the rhythm of wind in the branches, the creak of the old rocker, the faint laughter from down the lane. Across the street, a moving truck idled beside Karen's house. She loaded a box into the trunk of her sedan, scarf wrapped tight. No one waved. Earl sipped his coffee and watched the winter sun creep higher along the horizon. "Not bad for a quiet retirement," he muttered to himself. And the porch light kept glowing. The snow hadn't melted, but something in Pine Hollow had quietly thawed. What began as one man's quiet stand against unfair rules became a ripple of change that reached every porch light in the neighborhood. When power is misused, it isolates, but when people come together, even the coldest silence can turn warm. Like a lantern left glowing through a long winter night, one steady voice can show others the way.